Welcome to our latest episode of the Lebanese Physicians Podcast. Medicine is evolving and so are the careers of physicians. While many doctors spend their lives at the bedside, others choose a different path, one that allows them to shape healthcare on a global scale through innovation, drug development, and leadership in the pharmaceutical industry. In this episode of the Lebanese Physicians Podcast, I'm actually joined by Dr. Safi Shahda, who's a good friend that I knew him from our Indianapolis days. He's an oncologist. He trained at Indiana University and started his career journey actually as an oncologist, but then switched into the pharmaceutical industry, initially joining Eli Lilly and Company, then Intellia Therapeutics, and now he is in AstraZeneca in Boston. We explore what it really matters, what it really means for physicians to transition into industry. We explore the fears, the misconceptions, the identity shifts and the opportunities that come with leaving the traditional medical path. Dr. Shahda, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Khalil. Happy to be here.
So, Safi, from the origin story for you is from clinic to pharma. What initially drew you from clinical oncology into the pharmaceutical industry? Because I remember you were a pretty good clinical oncologist, and suddenly you told me, all right, I'm leaving, I'm going to Eli Lilly.
So, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity to be here, and it's a topic I'm really passionate about. So, as you mentioned, I'm currently working at AstraZeneca. Just to highlight, this is a conversation about my views and my experience. It does not really represent necessarily how AstraZeneca view this topic. And one comment, I'm still an oncologist, so I have oncology runs in my blood, basically. It's a passion of mine. So going back to thinking about the transition and how I made that pivot a little over 7 years ago now, it goes back beyond the last 7 years since I made the transition to the biopharma industry. It really started with why I went to medicine in the first place. I went to medicine wanting to make a difference for people living with illnesses, in particular in oncology, and for people who live with cancer. And that what really drew me to consider an academic medicine with an interest in focusing on clinical research. So as I trained at Indiana University, did my fellowship there, I was offered a faculty position with a focus on caring for people living with GI cancers. My interest was always in focus on clinical research to improve the lives of people living with cancer and create opportunities for therapy. I approached that from the lens of doing that from the academic perspective. There was a point where, as I learned around the process, about the process and experienced that process working in academia, doing clinical research, I realized to make the impact at scale that I would like to do, pharmaceutical industry would be the right place for me to influence the process and do that at a scale. And that what led me really to pivot.
So that was your defining moment, I guess, to step away from full clinical practice.
So there was not really a tipping point in particular. It was more or less of an evolving process. I still view my career as evolving. It started again thinking about what I wanted to do and what are the opportunities available for me at the time as an academic physician, which with a focus on clinical research, there are a number of avenues an academic physician could do, in particular in oncology, where you have a lot of research going on in clinical research. Some of that is dependent on access to these clinical trials that come from the pharmaceutical industry. Others could be ideas that one would come up with to approach funding to get these clinical trials. But what I realized my interest was really in influencing these very early decisions. So for example, why a particular drug is going to certain indications, why a clinical trial was designed in a certain way with a particular endpoint. I wanted to be able to think through all of these, accelerate the path for clinical trial, get these medicine to be tested quickly, and get answers that can actually influence clinical practice. And this accumulated over time as I was experiencing again my academic career, building relationship with people in the industry, getting to speak to people, that idea formulated more and more over time, where it became clear to me that the way my career is shaping and the influence I would like to have, that's what led me to make that transition.
So yeah, when you made that transition, you got like an early role in pharma. So how did your clinical experience shape your early role? And what role do people usually get in? Because my understanding is even if you have like 10 years of experience in clinical medicine, if you go to pharma, you still have to start at the bottom of the ladder and then climb the ladder up. Is that true or not?
It depends on the experience. Clinical medicine certainly provide a lot of unique experience, I would say, having the firsthand patient experience, understanding what that looks like. But what I really had also is quite a bit of research experience. I was a principal investigator or sub-investigator on many clinical trials, anywhere from first-in-human oncology clinical trials across number of modalities to phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials that ultimately led to drug approvals. So I've had that research experience on the investigator side that gave me the opportunity to not necessarily go for like a starting role as a medical director, but rather accounting for that experience. Now, for physicians who are considering a transition, there are a number of things we need to consider, and certainly we can talk about that. But there are roles in clinical development which could span anywhere from early phase to late phase. It could be an indication specific. You can think about oncology, cardiometabolic, and others. It could be a modality specific. It depends on one's experience, whether it is in genetic medicine or others, focusing on delivery as well. And there are roles beyond clinical development, such as medical affairs, regulatory science, and others.
Exactly. So that opens up the question is if a physician is considering the move, right? Like a lot of like these days, I think a lot of physicians may be considering a move from clinical medicine. What are the first practical steps they should take?
So one would be to really taking a step back and thinking about one's interests and what is motivating that question. Is it a it's is it a burnout related to specific practice? Is it interest in exploring new opportunities? Is it an interest in exploring new career? So having that really honest conversation with oneself to understand what's motivating that move would be really important. And then I would encourage people to explore that further. So talk to people, reach out to people, connect with people, and ask questions because it's definitely a lot of unknown for one who does not have necessarily that experience. Even though I worked in my academic days with several pharma companies, I really had no idea what the role involves on the other side, even though I interacted with them. And even after speaking with many and describing what the role would look like, until you get to that role and start working day to day, there is a lot to uncover. But the first thing I would advise people to consider is to really take a step back, ask the question what motivates them, and then start exploring. We're talking about pharma, but there are other roles that one could consider in a number of industries, including the venture capital world, where physicians, especially who have science background or MD PhDs, could have significant contribution. You think about regulatory science and the FDA being medical reviewers also on new drug applications.
Right, exactly. There's multiple other avenues these days that people can consider, and that's why it's important to consider why you're leaving, because you don't want to like go to also to an industry where you might not like the work that you're doing there. So you move, you start your transition. What were the biggest challenges during the transition, and how did you overcome them?
So I think one of the first things that kind of was very evident to me. So you go from an academic physician where taking care of patients, you ultimately have to make the decisions, right? Shared informed consent, you provide information to patients, but ultimately you help them decide on treatment. You make these decisions for their treatment plan, diagnosis, and so forth. Making rounds with trainees, you also mentor them, you have that uh, figure role in the team structure. Moving to pharma, it is, you appreciate how large the team, how complex the process is in drug development, and the number of disciplines, the number of team members and functions that are involved. And so what became very clear to me very early on, so I bring certain set of experience and skills, and certainly I'm the expert in that domain, for example, so I provide my input. And so do others on the team, from thinking about clinical operations to regulatory science to translational medicine, chemistry. It depends on what stage the drug is in. So being mindful of that working model, as well as acknowledging one's limitations, so what I know and what I don't know, and rely on others to provide their expertise. That was definitely a change where in patient's care, I, I I used to be one who's making most of the decisions for patients, and now I'm making decisions, but I'm contributing in my own domain. But there are a lot of other domains, other experts are contributing to.
Right. And I think you can make, probably it's a lot more in pharma, but even in clinical medicine now, I don't think we should, like ourselves, like when you're rounding or doing something, there's also the pharmacists, the nutritionists, the social workers. So there's a lot of contribution also from multiple other specialties in the care of the patient. So, but maybe it probably is not as much as pharma. I think you still make a lot of decisions yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is a lot of resemblance about thinking about team structure and being a team player amongst this in the larger ecosystem. You definitely see it more pronounced, I would say, in the structure of teams in pharma.
Right. What are the most common misconceptions physicians have about pharma careers?
I mean, so like it, there could be number of ones, right? It's one that is not really visible for many on what is the role a physician can play in the biopharma world, and that is another one that I learned a lot as I joined in, where initially my thinking was you have limited role as a medical director, you would be leading a study and so forth, but there are a number of opportunities really that can span beyond clinical development and could have influence in a number of ways, whether it is, again, on the clinical development side, being in regulatory science, being in medical affairs. Some have interest in the business side, so they get involved in business development and so forth.
Yes, so it's like, yeah, basically it doesn't have to be the same job everyone would be able to
Right.
take. So you did multiple roles, like you started Eli Lilly, then you went into biotech with Intellia Therapeutics, right? And then you went back to AstraZeneca. So what did moving from big pharma to biotech and back teach you about innovation and agility? Because obviously you had to also change sort of careers when you did that.
Right. So biotech and pharma operate differently, and these are general, in a way, describing this in general terms, really not specific to a particular company. And even within that grouping, really very broad spectrum of companies. So you tend to think about pharmaceutical companies who have a very large pipeline, have drugs that are already approved, so there is a flow of revenue, and that funds the engine of R&D in the company. And often when thinking about biotech, so you could look at biotechs that are 20 people, and you can look at biotechs that are several thousand people, and these are very different biotechs. So if also a biotech is pre-commercial or a commercial company, there are different considerations. So there is a very broad spectrum there, and really when one thinks about a biotech, what that encompasses. And even within the biotech system, you can think of a biotech that could have a single asset. And so all biotech outcome and future is really dependent on how well they develop that asset. and whether that asset has a future or a liability. And then others could use multiple assets bundled under a delivery mechanism, under a disease therapeutic area, under a pathway that could span, say, oncology and immunology and inflammation in other organs, or others developing a platform that they are investing a lot in the platform and then plan to build multiple drugs that can impact patients across many indications once they establish that platform. So it could be pretty broad. Also, the resources are different between large pharma and the smaller biotech. The support, the environment could be, and that could give you more opportunities to wear multiple hats and get experience across multiple domains also when you're working with smaller teams. But also larger companies provide a lot of support and rich history and experience that could resemble your large academic institution where they have all the expertise and so forth. The reasons I made these transitions came really to how my career was evolving and the experience I've had at Lilly, which was tremendous experience across both early phase and late phase. Two of the drugs I worked on at that time, now they are approved. So it's really remarkable to see that these drugs could be now making impact for patients in real world practice, not just in the clinical trial. But I had certain set of experience in oncology in early phase and late phase. I started in GI cancers in my academic career. I pivoted to other indications based on the opportunities I had. But then I got introduced to Intellia that is working on CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing to develop therapy. And it was a really remarkable opportunity to have that experience working outside oncology, also just to see what the drug development outside oncology could look like. So getting completely out of my comfort zone and also get my hand on new technology and understand how regulators think about the technology and what the experience looked like. And so that what led me to go to Intellia, working on a couple of different assets and clinical trials. My heart has always been in oncology, as I shared in the beginning of this conversation. So I always had passion to come back to oncology. I worked on the program I did at Intellia, got it to a really a place where I felt comfortable to move back to oncology. And now at AstraZeneca, I got a great opportunity where I went back to now working in the GI cancer space, which is a space I'm really passionate about. There is a great unmet medical need for patients and very, very eager to go back and make a difference there.
Right, you got a pretty good role at AstraZeneca. You're currently clinical head in late development oncology, right? And yeah, as we discussed that, I was just going to go back. So Intellia, I know them because also they were used to work in the alpha-1 antitrypsin world too, which I was involved in some clinical trials on. So that's interesting that because a lot of these companies were like that. Like there's also InhiBarX, which also was working on oncology, but then also on other things like alpha-1 and stuff like that. So this is the interesting thing about these jobs. But so you have this role right now, and how does this, because like as a physician, you influence outcomes of the patients around you, but then when you're, like you said, when you're working on approvals of drugs, these can have impacts on patients globally, I guess, nationally and globally. So how does your role in AstraZeneca currently influence patient outcomes globally?
So I'm currently a global clinical head of one of our late phase assets. The drug is already approved in several indications. So overseeing the spectrum of the clinical development in GI cancers of this particular asset. And so I see my role in a number of domains. One of them is ensuring our clinical development continues as we have planned and our strategy is executed on as well. It gives me an opportunity to also mentor and lead very talented team and developing the next generation of oncology and drug developers. And to your point, clinical medicine taught me how to care for patients, and the industry role taught me how to scale up that level. And so the way I view it is when these trials read out and it depends on the results, the goal is to be able to share this data, communicate that data. So working with others within the organization to be able to do so. but also make sure these drugs are able to get to patients if the data supports that. And that goes beyond just the patients in my clinical practice who were able to come to my clinic. And I always say this, the patients that get on our clinical trials or ultimately get drugs, many of them I will never meet and see, but I know that what we did made an impact for them.
Right, exactly. You're not going to meet a lot, but your drug is being spread around the world. So basically, what excites me, because now there's a lot of talk about the use of AI to be able to develop more targeted therapies for multiple cancers and probably much faster than we used to do in the past. So what excites you the most about the future of oncology drug development in this era?
Right. So oncology came a long way and still have a very long way to go to really minimize the burden of cancer on patients. And you can think about that in so many different ways. So thinking about how can we accelerate that? If we were to think about 15, 20 years ago, everybody who had breast cancer got the same treatment. Everybody who had lung cancer got the same treatment. And now we just know so much that it's just not acceptable to do that anymore. And what else can we know if we were to shorten that time horizon from 15 years to 2 or 3 years to learn that much knowledge in a shorter period of time? So AI application could span so many different aspects. You can think about drug discovery, and there are a lot of effort across the industry and the tech world on how we can accelerate drug discovery and use AI to not just improve drug discovery, but also improve the success rate, right? Where you have a lot of drugs don't move from preclinical to clinical because of liability with toxicity. They don't move from early phase to late phase because of lack of efficacy or something unpredictable evolved and or developed in these, or this, sorry, something unpredictable or was not expected from preclinical and then was discovered in early phase studies. So are there ways to model and explore all of these possibilities to improve the success rate from drugs moving from preclinical to clinical to late stage clinical development? And then within clinical development, there are a number of things that teams do on day-to-day basis where AI could enhance their work and accelerate their work. So you can, again, it could be from discovery, applicability, and implementation all across the board.
Right, exactly. And so as we discussed right now, I was going to ask you, did you ever struggle with leaving clinical identity behind?
Not necessarily. I don't feel actually, I, I, I didn't leave my clinical identity behind. I felt I moved to a role that allowed me to do what I wanted to impact clinical practice in a different way. And it is something, again, did not happen overnight where one day I just got frustrated and packed and said, I'm done. That was never the case. It is a process that evolved over a few years, actually, where as some of these discussions I was having with peers around various opportunities, I just could not see myself not seeing patients in the clinic. But then as I realized what I really wanted to do for people living with cancer and the ways I can do it, it became more clear to me that approaching it from the lens I'm approaching it with right now is the path forward. And I felt I had significant clinical experience between my training and my days in academia that were very rewarding, building these very deep personal relationship with people who are at the hardest time in their life, especially people living with cancer. And GI cancers are one of the most difficult, challenging cancers. So I had a really great privilege for caring for many people, and I felt, again, deeply honored to do so. But I wanted to do that at a scale, and I wanted to do it at a very accelerated time to make an impact. So even now, for people who work with me, they see it anytime we're making decisions is thinking about what does it mean for patients who are going through this experience? How do we make our clinical trials patient-friendly when we're making decisions having patient in mind?
Yeah, so basically you moved from like impacting patients individually to impacting a lot of patients in a different way, although you don't interact with them face to face at this point. That's a big
Right.
difference, I think, that people see. So my next question for you is like if somebody wants to make this transition that you've made, how important is networking, mentorship, all this other stuff when you do this?
I think these are always important, whether they choose to make a transition or not. Building relationship connections, having the right mentors, these are extremely impactful. I can tell you some of the pivotal moments in my career happened randomly at times I was not expecting. Some of the transitions I made, or even going back to the days before I moved to the United States, some of these were again very serendipitous opportunities. You just never know what you may come across when you speak to people. I encourage people to always explore. One would not lose anything by exploring other opportunities. If anything, it may provide other avenues if someone is interested in making a career pivot. It may also provide the clarity about the person's purpose and what they are doing, and can actually sharpen their views on their career path and how they can actually focus their career path once they are able to explore and understand the environment around them. So I think these are important regardless.
Right, exactly. That's why I always tell people if you get an opportunity, explore it. You won't lose anything and you would learn more about it and also learn more about whether you want to stay in your current job
Right.
or whether the other job works better for you in that case. So, are there specific roles like medical affairs, clinical development, or regulatory that are better entry points if somebody wants to enter into pharma?
I
Or
think it depends really on the person's interest and their experience, right? So I think it's fair to think about it from the lens, what is the title? What's the role I'm going to have? But the other way to look at it is what is the experience that one has? What does that role require? And making sure getting a person to the role that will set them up for success.
exactly.
It's a very different environment. It's a highly regulated environment. It is highly collaborative, and things move at a different speed. And so there are things we should also probably talk about as well on what would make that transition successful. But it really comes down to one's interest and background experience and what's available also on the other side.
Right. Yeah, because let's say if you were at the FDA, then obviously regulatory would be a good job or entry point for you to do. If you were a
That's
clinical
right.
person, maybe clinical development or medical affairs would be better options for somebody
Right.
to.
And one other, actually, just I missed that part earlier as we were talking. So clinical safety is another area that could be, I would say, more flexible. This is a department that is involved in patient safety, have significant contribution to drug development from early phase to regulatory approval and surveillance when the drug is available on the market. And given that the scope is patient safety, could potentially open the door for physicians with various backgrounds. I've seen people anywhere from anesthesiology background, surgery, ophthalmology, internal medicine, family medicine in these roles.
Right, exactly. Because this is actually a very important role that we did not discuss, which is you see it a lot in all the clinical trials if you've ever been involved in clinical
Right.
trials, but also real world afterwards. Like after the drug is released, if
That's
there's
right.
problems, then they're going to come back to the company to be reported in that case. So if you go, which brings me now, because you were just kind of discussed like how what people do in their transition. If you could go back, what would you do differently in your transition from clinical to pharma?
I would have explored more. I would have asked more questions just to make sure I understand the role and just be eager to learn. That's really being humble, eager to learn. I learned a ton from science to medicine. Medicine learned it in training, right? But also the applicability of that. I think I learned more about clinical trials. I learned more about stats. biostats and regulatory in my years in pharma than ever before.
Right, exactly. Because you know a lot about clinical medicine, but you don't know as
Right.
much. You have to accept that you're going to have to learn a lot once you get to a new role in that
Yes.
case.
And
So,
that's the fun part, frankly, because you feel there is always something new to learn, and the
right,
field evolves a lot. And even when you learn, say, clinical trial design in early phase, clinical trial design in late phase has completely different consideration. You learn about one modality, but then if you're applying new modality, it's a novel modality, then the considerations are different. And so this is the fun part, really, is there is constant learning, constant change. And then there are a lot of peers in the industry also with the way the ecosystem functions. So there is constant change, constant learning, and that creates ambiguity, right? You, at least I don't feel there is always a place where I feel very comfortable and I'm in my comfort zone. Things are constantly changing, which makes it interesting. But on the flip side, someone might find this as an uncomfortable situation to be in when there is this ambiguity.
right. I think like ambiguity or instability, but that's also a good thing because I think it keeps you innovating. So otherwise
Right.
you get bored, like you're sitting around, you're stable. But I think my opinion is everything changes. Like people think, oh, I'm going to stay where I am, nothing's going to change, but no, things will change around you, but you can still stay where you are. Doesn't matter. So it comes to my last question, which is actually going to be a tricky one for you. No, I'm kidding. If you had to summarize your journey in one sentence for physicians considering a similar path that you did, what would it be?
Um, have a look, have an inward look to understand really what you care about, what's your passion, what motivates you, and go out and explore it. I mean, this is one career you would have, and so make it count.
Right. Safi, and I agree with you 100% on this. I think always look at where you are. Are you satisfied with what you're doing? And then explore other opportunities. And you never know, you might find the right opportunity for you that you never thought about in the first place. So,
I never went to this career knowing, not this career, like to academic medicine, thinking I will end up actually doing what I'm doing now. My focus was I wanted to go to academic medicine. I want to do clinical research. I want to take care of patients, offer patients clinical trials, and just go through the academic ladder. And again, as I spoke to people, as I explored my career, I realized there are other opportunities that allow me to do what I want to do at a much bigger scale that I could envision doing in my role. Not to mention, I loved what I did and I, again, enjoyed it, but this opened the door for new opportunities that I did not even know they existed.
exactly. You took the risk, and there you are in Boston right now at AstraZeneca. Happy, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and it was great seeing you again.
But likewise, Khalil, thank you for the opportunity. Enjoyed our conversation. Great to see you.
Thank